Hello. Um, I'm Cory Booker, the mayor of Newark, New Jersey. I'm glad you could all be here. So there's a lot of you here, and I've never really done quite this thing before. So I think the most fun thing would just be to take questions and talk about whatever it is you guys want to talk about, and so I will leave plenty of time to do that. But I want to start by talking a little bit about what I wrote this book about. And the reason that I wrote a book when I already have plenty of other opportunity to say whatever I want all the time is because there was this one thing that I felt like was a really important dynamic in American history and American politics that did not reduce easily to broadcastable length. It did not reduce easily to either radio monologues, like I used to do in talk radio, or debate formats, or being on TV, just because it takes about 280 pages to say. And that's the subject of my book, this idea that the way that we moor or unmoor the military power that we have as a country is something that we've lost touch with a little bit, something that we've stopped controlling, that our politics and our martial power are disconnected. So I want to talk about that a little bit right now just to get us started. But then, as I said, I'm happy to talk to you about anything in Q&A. And I think you just, it's like Ask Rachel or something. Ask Maddow? Hashtag Ask Maddow, if you want to do that. All right. So I'm turning 40 in about 5 minutes, which is, yeah, I made it! I never thought that I would make drinking age, but boy, did I. So I'm turning 40, and that means that I have been thinking a lot about getting old. And that was made all the worse recently when I decided that it's weird. You know, we all know what our zodiac signs are, right? Which is when, based on the month and the day that you were born. I'm an Aries. A lot of us also know the Chinese year in which you were born. I am year of the ox, which gives you some idea into what it's like to have a disagreement with me in my personal life. I'm a ram and an ox. It's really fun. But I felt like as Americans, we should also all know our birth president. Who was president when you were born? It's hard to remember, right? We don't think of these things. And it's a way to really make yourself feel old, because you don't have, like, you could be 68 years old and your birth president is FDR. So I feel very, very old to have realized that my birth president was Nixon. I was born in April 1973, and so he didn't actually end up being my childhood president because he had to ship off the following year. But I realize now that I am very old, and there are people who I consider to be friends whose birth president is like Poppy Bush, or even Bill Clinton, which blows my mind. Does anybody here have Poppy Bush as their birth president, born between 1989 and 1993? All right, I'm sorry. Okay, so, but imagine your birth president is Poppy Bush. You're born in 1990. So by 2007, by 2007, you are a high school senior. Say you are a high school senior in 2007. We are 4 years into Iraq and 6 years into Afghanistan by then. If you are feeling a call to patriotic duty, a sense of adventure, thinking about the training opportunities offered by a career in the United States Armed Forces, where do you tell your recruiter that you would like to end up? Probably not in a missile silo in Minot, North Dakota. In the post-9/11 era, who would want the job of sitting through nuclear winter on the high plains, running maintenance on 35 B-52s, guarding the silos that housed 150 giant and largely untested intercontinental ballistic missiles, babysitting the hundreds of smaller nuclear warheads stored in sod-topped bunkers like canned fruit shelved in a tornado shelter? An Air Force general told the Senate recently, our younger airmen, once they've reached that decision point, if they've been stationed in one of our northern bases where the environment's a little bit tougher, they tend to leave the service. Those who didn't leave the service stick around with tending the nuke's life for as short a time as possible. In 2007, if you were an airman assigned to a nuclear bomber wing, you could look around and note that more than 8 in 10 of the members of the security force working on your bomber wing would be rookies. One senior officer in the Air Force's nuclear enterprise admitted that standing alert duty in nuclear missile silos is not considered deployed. So it's a low-status job, because if you are not a deployer, you do not get promoted. The Air Force pleaded for more nuclear missileers, but deployments in support of regional conventional operations, like Iraq and Afghanistan, decrease manpower available to the nuclear mission. But even without Iraq and Afghanistan siphoning off military talent, would anybody expect some ambitious young airman to be clamoring for silo duty? Would you really want to work in the nuclear weapons part of the military? A Pentagon Blue Ribbon Task Force on the nation's nuclear mission declared in 2008, "We need a nuclear career field." 60 years into America's nuclear superpower age, 60 years as the only nation to have ever used a nuclear weapon against an enemy in wartime, 60 years of hair-trigger nuclear alert, and we still don't have a nuclear career field. We used to have one, but it has been eclipsed by changing times and changing wars. Consider page 13 of a recently declassified 2007 report on the care and feeding of our nation's nuclear weapons at Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport, Louisiana. Here are the recommended improvement areas. Corrosion on numerous H-1388 storage and shipping containers. Forward missile antenna sealant is delaminated. And numerous air-launched cruise missiles have fungus on leading edge of wings. While our nuclear-armed cruise missiles were growing leading-edge wing fungus in the subtropical moisture of Louisiana, other U.S. military flying hardware was having rather the opposite problem. In the words of Defense Industry Daily, they were flying their wings off. In 2006, the Air Force embarked on an emergency upgrade of the nation's fleet of C-130 aircraft. After heavy service moving cargo and flying combat missions as retrofitted gunships, these huge planes' wing boxes were failing. Wing boxes are what keep the wings on. They're what keep the wings attached to the fuselage. So you can take your pick of your maintenance priorities, American taxpayer. Wings falling off enormous gunships in the Middle East and Central Asia from constant use in the longest simultaneous land wars in U.S. history, or sedentary nuclear missiles in Shreveport growing fungus. Nukes and their auxiliary equipment were generally designed to have a lifespan of about 10 to 20 years. Constant manufacturing and modernization were the assumptions back in the glory days. But by the start of the Barack Obama presidency, some of that nuclear hardware had been in service for 40 or even 50 years. Bad enough that the missiles were growing wing fungus and the storage containers were rusting through. For the more serious nuclear maintenance issues, we had by then started shoveling money into something called the Stockpile Life Extension Program, SHLEP, which is still essentially a program of artificial hips and pacemakers and penile implants for aging nukes. How would you like to be responsible for operating on a half-century-old nuclear bomb? How many nuclear bombs does the United States need to complete every conceivable military mission in which we would use them? An attack with one of the nuclear weapons we've got now would cause an explosion about 10 times the size of the one at Hiroshima. Can you imagine us setting off Hiroshima now? Can you imagine us setting off 2 bombs, each 10 times the size of Hiroshima now? Can you imagine us setting off 5 of those bombs? Can you imagine us setting off 50 bombs, each of which is 10 times the size of Hiroshima? Can you imagine that we would have use for 50 of them? What do we imagine would be on the list of 50 targets for those 50 American nuclear blasts, each 10 times the size of Hiroshima? Our current arsenal of nukes is roughly 5,000 weapons. A senior defense official told me in 2011, "We don't have any enemies in Congress. We have to fight Congress to cut programs, not keep them." And those are basically the only fights the Pentagon ever loses. To paraphrase Ronald Reagan, plagiarizing Senator James Burns, talking smack about government bureaucracy, if you want to achieve immortality, see what you can do about getting yourself turned into a Pentagon program. You may eventually grow wing fungus, but you will never die. The nuclear weapons complex, the counterinsurgency nation-building apparatus, now our recently acquired $20 billion worth of mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles with giant V-shaped holes to disperse the energy from bombs that explode beneath them. We built those things, we own them, and we are looking for ways to use them. The tasks that we assign our soldiers, our service members, are hard enough without asking them to get their work done in the world's largest organization, while dragging around decades' worth of clattering battle rattle in the form of defunct and deathless programs. We all have an interest in America having an outstanding military, but that aim is not helped by exempting the military from the competition for resources. With no check on its growth, no rival for its political influence, the superfunded, super-empowered national security state has become Leviathan. I am not a pacifist. I have a lot of respect for pacifism. I think that pacifism is a fully cognizant philosophy and strategy that should not be dismissed as naive. And although I respect that view, I do not share that belief that war is always the single worst option, that war is never necessary. And because of that, because I'm not a pacifist, I respect and support the decision of our country to maintain a robust military. And I also don't think we're doing any favors to that military to insulate them from the competition for resources, from the competition for resources with other things that our country wants to do besides maintain that military. In part, the problem is that we saddle the military with all sorts of stuff that they don't want, that doesn't make sense for their own priorities. Last year, the military spent most of the year fighting with Congress over some tanks. It didn't get a lot of press, but did you read about the tank fight between Congress and the military? The fight was that Congress really, really wanted the military to have these tanks, and the military did not want the tanks. This is kind of backwards the way most fights go, right? Take this extra money in your budget. No, we don't want it. No, you must have it. What kind of math is this, right? Everybody else is scraping to try to, avoid the sequester or whatever cuts are coming down from whatever manufactured crisis of the moment. But the military is having money shoved down its throat that it doesn't want. It's the kind of fight that we have in this part of public policy that we do not have in any other area of public policy in our country. And that insulation, that cossets, and that does no favors to the decisions about what we spend on. I think that's the same insulation that plagues the decisions about what we do with our military, about who we fight and where and when. What this book is about is that over the past 30 to 40 years, in a nonpartisan way, in a way that I think is non-conspiratorial, there's just people trying to get away what they found to be frustrating impediments to what they wanted to do. I think we changed our way of going to war, essentially so that it is not so much of a hassle anymore. It's a nonpartisan problem. Presidents and other leadership on both sides, they just keep making decisions that make the use of force easier and less controversial. So if you don't want to convince Congress to get on board, you come up with ways to go to war that it's just the president say so and Congress never gets involved. Anybody here who has George H.W. Bush or Bill Clinton or George W. Bush as a birth president, you have to go beyond your lifespan to read about Ronald Reagan really innovating in the particular field of finding ways to go to war without Congress knowing. If you don't want to upset the population by making your call-ups too big, when you go abroad to fight, you can augment the number of people that you call up with private contractors. Private companies don't even have to disclose publicly when one of their personnel is killed in a war zone. So policymakers can really count on those folks not being missed in the same way that soldiers are. If you don't want to persuade the public that whatever cause you want to go fight for is worth American treasure and American blood, you can do it not just secret from Congress, but secret from the American public too. That's why it's really important that we have now developed the CIA as a branch of the military, because the CIA is deniable. Their actions are not just secret, they're covert, and covert means when asked if those actions happened, policymakers will not admit to them. That's a great way to wage wars that you don't want the public involved in. If you don't want to explain where we are at war, the tactics we are using in that war, then do it in secret. If you don't want to tally up the financial cost, then pretend there isn't a financial cost. Cut taxes at the same time we're starting wars. Make people think that wars are free. Don't budget for the cost. Make it an emergency supplemental. So we're like a goldfish swimming around in the bowl. Oh, look, a castle. Ooh, look, a castle. Ooh, look, a castle. Every year, surprise, it's an emergency supplemental. And it's been there for 8 years. We have come up with all of these ways to wage war in ways that get around the constraints that were put there on purpose to make us a country that doesn't go to war too much. That's how our country was designed. And we have, in an accelerated pace over the last 30 or 40 years, been eating away at those constraints that were there to make us a deliberately peaceable country. I mean, think about what the colonists were pissed about. I mean, the colonists were generally pissed. But had the colonists not resisted the cost of supporting the British military and paying for British military adventurism around the world, there would not be an America. And so the Founding Fathers, in writing the Constitution, wrote it in such a way that would preclude us from becoming as warlike as Britain was, because boy, did they think that was a waste, and boy, did they resent it. Because we've gone through those changes at the political level, for us civilians just living our lives, the consequence for us is that war is something that we don't really feel. The main reason I felt like this is an important enough thing to write a book about, and to try to get the chance to talk about these issues in a longer form way than I get to do on TV every night, I think is mostly because of my emotional feeling about the gap in experience over the last 12 years between military families' lives and the rest of our lives. Since 9/11, if you are in the military or if you're in a military family, your life has been very, very, very different than the rest of American civilians. I mean, you talk to veterans, particularly like special skills operators, right? Special ops people and stuff like that, who have been called to deploy time and time and time again since 9/11. You talk to their families, you talk to their spouses, their parents, and their life, compared to ours, has been harrowing for the past 12 years. We have fought a lot of wars as a country. Revolutionary War, Civil War, First World War, Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, 1812, the Spanish-American War, Bosnia, freaking Grenada, Panama. I mean, we fought a lot of wars. And as a big country who has been in a lot of wars, it is a big deal for a country as big as ours, with as many wars under our belt as we have, to be fighting right now our longest war ever. We are in our longest war ever right now, still. And for 8.5 years of that longest war, we were simultaneously in another large land war at the same time, which was also one of the longest wars in our history. And less than 1% of our population took care of both of those for us at the same time. The same 1%. While we got tax cuts. Remember, the first round of Bush tax cuts was June 2001? So it was 3 months after we got the Bush tax cuts in June 2001. 3 months after that, we got 9/11. And then a few weeks after 9/11, we invaded Afghanistan and started the war in Afghanistan. Nobody ever ventured the prospect that we would take back the tax cuts because we had had 9/11 and because we are now starting a war in response. In fact, a global war. Nobody said, maybe we should pay for this. Maybe this isn't the time to be giving citizens tax cuts. But we did that in June 2011. We didn't take them back. And then less than 2 years after we started the war in Afghanistan, we started another simultaneous land war in Iraq at the same time. And what happened a few weeks after we started the Iraq war? The second round of Bush tax cuts. So what is our relationship now with the Americans who have done the fighting there? It's mixed. I talked to Iraq and Afghanistan veterans groups, and one of the things that I hear voiced from them is that there's this real disconnect between the emotional connection that civilians who haven't been in wartime are trying to make with them and the thanks that they get, and then the way that it's not actually being manifest in them being treated properly in policy. We have sort of a hero worship thing going on with people who have done particularly some of the worst fighting over the past 12 years. But what I hear from veterans is that hero worship and pity can be two sides of the same coin, because they're both born of alienation. They're also pretty closely related to fear. I worship you, I think you're amazing, I pity you, I think that you are a tragedy, and I'm afraid of you because I don't know you. But they all come from the same place, which is that you are not me. I am alienated from you. You are a fundamentally different kind of person than I am. Actually, I have one other thing I should read. When I was talking about this thesis of the book with Paul Rieckhoff, who founded Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, he told me, it's like AIDS was 30 years ago. It's a huge crisis for us, but no one else in the country thinks they are us. No one even thinks they are like us. And so as the country sort of learned to be untroubled by the fact that we had troops at war, troops who had had this very different experience than the rest of us just turned to look to each other. Our sacrifice and their sacrifice have been almost opposite images of each other. As they have taken on more over time, we have found it easier and easier to notice what it is they are doing. Does it feel like we're at war right now in Afghanistan? But you know, the feeling that we do have of thanks and respect for the troops, I think is an important feeling. I mean, the Super Bowl, there was the 2-minute ad during the Super Bowl this year that was a Jeep ad that was voiced by Oprah. Remember that ad in the Super Bowl? You have been cried over, you have been prayed for, you have been missed. At the Rose Bowl this year, they staged the homecoming of a soldier from Afghanistan on a moving float in the parade. My insurance company, the insurance you're able to get if you're the child of a veteran or if you're a veteran, USAA is now faking soldier homecomings in their ads now. If you get tired of watching hedgehogs eating carrot sticks online, which I realize is actually my favorite thing to do online, but if you ever, for some reason, get tired of watching hedgehogs go like this, you can also while away the hours on the Welcome Home blog, which bills itself as the #1 site for videos of surprise military homecomings. I actually don't feel all that cynical about how emotionally rewarding we find it to see a soldier coming home. This guaranteed, marketable, even monetizable emotional payoff that we civilians now dependably demonstrate in reaction to this narrated truth of seeing soldiers close that distance, of seeing soldiers and their families and recognizing how much they have given up when we have given up nothing. I mean, we cry. I cry every single time. I even cry at the fake ones in the USAA ads. We cry when we see soldiers rush into the arms of their kids and their wives and their husbands and their dogs, right? Because they are returning from something that means something to us. You know, we buy soldiers beers when we see them in uniform. We applaud them on planes when the captain points them out. And Jeep decides to sell cars during the Super Bowl in partnership with the USO, and Oprah agrees to narrate it because this is potent stuff for us, and that's important. It's important that it does have emotional potency, that we do care. Fighting and dying in the name of the United States of America, surviving war or not surviving war, enduring the sacrifice that comes with going to war, is a really potent and important thing to us as Americans. And the distance that we feel from it is legit patriotic discomfort. That we didn't spend the last 12 years at war, we had these other guys do it for us. Whether the next war is in Iran or Syria or here, or whether the next war is so long off from now that we cannot even foresee it now and we don't know what conflict it will arise from. Whatever the next war is, it should never again feel like it is not us at war, that it is not our country going to war, that we've sent other people to do it for us. Our guilt and our respect for them and the emotional depth of that feeling is the measure of how much it's not right for us as Americans to do it that way. We used to be a country that went to war. Now we are a country that sends its military to war, and we've got nothing to do with it. And we were designed specifically as a country that it would never be so. But I think the changes that have brought us that far are ones that have happened relatively recently. It didn't happen over centuries. It didn't happen because some bad guy decided that it ought to be that way. It happened that way because we stopped appreciating what was important about our constitutional inheritance on these issues. And I think if we did appreciate it again, it would not be that hard to get back to the way it's supposed to be. So that's my shtick on war and politics. And I am happy to continue to talk about war and politics. I could do it for about 7 straight hours. And then I would become the leader of a communist country. But I would also say that don't feel constrained by this topic. If you want to ask me questions, I'm happy to talk to you about anything. But thank you so much for coming out. It's really nice to see you all here. No, 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 no. La, 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 la. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. I wasn't fishing for that, I swear. I really wasn't fishing for that.
All right, well, thank you all again for coming. Just a reminder, we are taking questions for Rachel at #AskMaddow. And our first question is from Dan Reezy, and it is, what person would you like to interview most that you haven't yet had the opportunity?
The opportunity to read again from the book. Ready? The dedication page. To former Vice President Dick Cheney, oh, please let me interview you. I would I would very much like to interview any member of the Cheney family, most particularly Mr., but any of them. It's never going to happen.
All right. Dina Parkinson asks, what would you say here at South by Southwest that you wouldn't say on MSNBC?
Oh. Am I allowed to swear at South by Southwest? Everybody's like,
we encourage it.
Say the F word. Filibuster. I don't know. I think I would probably say, may I please have a Miller Lite? Here's the thing. I'm on MSNBC, I can't swear, and I can't talk about stuff that's going to bore a large national television audience. But other than that, I'm pretty much unconstrained to do what I want. So I guess it's swearing and drinking and stuff, and boring stuff. Yeah.
All right, I'll prod you a little bit. And this is a question for myself. You talked there at the end about, how we sort of push the military as these other guys that were taking care of the war. Do you think at all that sort of treating all of our military personnel as heroes, when we know that some do more or less than others, special operators do special things, and they all deserve respect, but do you think that having them all as heroes leads us into the trap of the sort of war culture that we've created for ourselves?
I think that it's sort of two different questions there. One is, does the way that we feel as civilians toward our military make us more likely to want to wage wars, make us more warlike as a country? And that's a deeper question. I think the more immediate question is, how much is our military woven into our life as civilians? And I think it was really important for us as a country that when we went to war, the idea would be that the country would be mobilized for war and that we wouldn't be asked to sort of saddle the burdens of military adventurism when those military adventures were not something that we thought was a good idea. That's why we have civilian control of the military. So mostly I think that calling everybody a hero is a shorthand for saying, I respect your decision to serve. But if that becomes an excuse just for stereotyping people as, I don't want to know more about you, I don't want to know what it is to serve, I don't know why you did serve, and I can't relate to where you have been or why you were doing it, I'm just glad you did it, not me. That I think is that's I think where we get into this sort of this alienation that you hear. I mean, for me, in talking to vets, that's what I hear most of all, even from very senior folks down to people who were infantrymen, that there is an alienating distance between American civilians now and them, particularly people who've had multiple deployments. I mean, if your 12 years since 9/11 have seen you back and forth to war 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times, and most Americans don't even know that we are at war, the distance between your level of sacrifice and who it's supposedly for, I think, is a very discomforting distance.
All right, Sarah Best asks, what role do you think social media has in creating change?
I think social media can make things go faster. And that doesn't necessarily mean that things are better, but it does mean that momentum momentum is manifest sooner than it otherwise would have been. When people can communicate instantly their reaction to something, that allows there to be more immediate feedback to whatever the initial action was. But also people can just make themselves known in a way that is outsized compared to the way we used to be able to do it. And that's good. It does also mean that we can make lurching, ill-considered movements quickly because we do it, because we're doing things in a less deliberate way. I mean, on balance, I'll take it. I'd rather have people's ability to be heard in this way than not have it. But I do think that there's caution associated with it too.
Do you think our quick reactions and our ability to make those quick reactions leads to a tendency to blow things out of proportion faster, or?
Well, I think it can lead to a tendency to leap to conclusions. You know, I mean, you even see it in my business in news reporting on breaking events. When you'll see a lot of news agencies make mistakes when they're counting on what people are saying in social media is what's going on about a particular story. So, you know, you'll find somebody who's associated with a breaking news event that everybody's very curious about, and a Facebook page that looks like it is of a person associated with that event ends up all over the news as a source of information about who this person is. And maybe it's a hoax, maybe it's just somebody with the same name, but we end up spreading that misinformation very quickly. I sort of feel like because in the news business and in the intersection of the news business and social media, what we need more than ever is really good journalistic standards and great editors. Yeah. This is the Editors Caucus. It's right here. Love you guys. Yeah.
All right, switching back to the military, Jenny Selber asks, what are your thoughts on reinstating the draft in the future?
Very interesting question. I have complicated feelings about it because obviously the way it feels at the surface level is our civilian population and our policymakers are totally dissociated from the consequences of making a decision to go to war. So let's force them to be associated by making sure that a non-random or a random cross-section of the population ends up getting called up. The sons and daughters of members of Congress should be there. I understand that. And General McChrystal, Stanley McChrystal, who was commander of Afghanistan, and after that Rolling Stone article by Michael Hastings ended up stepping down. He wrote a book recently and did a whole bunch of interviews, really good interviews around the book. And one of them, he really made the case that we ought to have a draft. We're too separate from the civilian population. At the same time, other people in the military, particularly people who are talking about the idea that we might need a smaller force, that we should sort of right-size our military and not maintain right now we spend as much on our military as every other conceivable rival in the world combined. Maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we should have a smaller force. If we're going to do that, you actually need kind of a high-skilled force, and compelling people to serve who don't want to, who never intended to, is maybe not the best way to build up a high-skilled force, and so maybe it's no favor to the military to give them a draft. That's part of the reason they wanted to get rid of it when they got rid of it after Vietnam. The other thing that makes me cautious about it is that the draft doesn't necessarily end up being just a straight cross-section of the population. I mean, when Johnson, at the beginning of the book, I spent some time talking about Johnson's decisions about what he was going to do about the call-up in Vietnam. So Kennedy would talk about Vietnam in ways that sort of at least left open the possibility that he was willing to do a big escalation there. I mean, it's debated now because we never got to see what the ultimate Kennedy presidency and with regard to that war would turn out like. But Johnson was really clear. Johnson was like, we are not sending our boys to go fight a land war in Asia. Asian boys ought to be doing that for themselves. And Johnson was not into it and did not want to make the case for having a big war in Vietnam, but he got persuaded once he was president that he needed to really escalate. He needed to go from 80 at one point to 180,000 troops there. And then it went, of course, much bigger than that. And when he was making the decision that he was going to really upscale the war there, but he did not want to make the argument. He didn't want to make the argument to Congress. He didn't want to make the argument to the people. He didn't want to get cold on the fact that he'd been saying, no, we're not going to escalate. He decided, you know what, I'm going to do it the easy way. We're going to do the draft. We're not going to call up the Guard and Reserves because that's going to be the way that connected members of families with political capital get their sons out of the war. We're going to use the draft because those are people who have no political capital, and if they can't get themselves out of the draft, that means that they can't complain loud enough that it's ever going to be a political problem for me. So he thought that the draft was the way that you'd keep it quiet. And it didn't work out that way in the end in Vietnam, but the fact that he was making that calculation at the beginning when he was making those decisions just makes me take seriously the complexity of that. It's not an open and shut case.
I apologize for destroying this name, but Olutosin Fashusi asks, how would you grade Obama as president and why that grade?
Oh, I'm so glad I'm not a teacher. I don't know. I mean, I care less about individual candidates and politicians than I do about policy. And so I could certainly give grades on different policies and meeting promises and whether or not they were good ideas for the country. I mean, I think it's incomplete, honestly. I know that sounds like a dodge, but there's a lot of things on which this president, I think, has exceeded expectations if you're a liberal, and a lot of things on which he has not exceeded expectations but says that he will still make it right. Like, just take the marquee case of closing Guantanamo. He said he would close Guantanamo within a year. It was clear within a year that he was not going to close Guantanamo. It's not that he didn't try. Congress blocked him from doing it. He says he's still going to. Okay, so no, you have not succeeded at closing Guantanamo, but I sort of believe him that he still wants to. And I am intrigued by the fact that the federal government did end up very quietly in October of last year buying that prison in Illinois. Remember, they were going to, when Guantanamo was going to close, it was going to be Guantanamo North, and they were going to open that, they were going to move all the Guantanamo prisoners to that prison in Thompson, Illinois. And the governor of Illinois at the time was like, yeah, we'd love to have them. We have this maximum security facility, and frankly, we need the jobs. And that's where they were going to go, and everybody freaked out. And Congress said, no, Guantanamo can't be closed and those prisoners can't be moved anywhere. And so that just got mothballed forever. People stopped talking about it, and then in October, the Justice Department bought that prison. So, I mean, presumably the freak out is still in effect, and that won't happen, but all of that stuff makes me more curious than conclusive.
So how do you grade the president's treatment of our current military and veterans?
It's a good question. There have been a lot of good, I think the tone has been right, and there have been a lot of efforts that I think have a lot of symbolic value. For example, Michelle Obama is best known for her anti-obesity efforts, exercise and eat right and all that stuff. But the other major thing that she has done as her cause as First Lady is focus on military families, as has Jill Biden. And that means that they're just doing a lot of events all the time that are maybe not making front page news, but that are actually working with organizations of veterans and their families in a way that I think is useful, and military spouses. Holly Petraeus, who ended up being in the news because of the bad way in which her husband left office, Holly Petraeus has actually been a real mover and shaker on getting that stuff done. And that doesn't necessarily always make headlines, like I said, but like when the Elizabeth Warren Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was formed, part of that attention within the administration meant that there was a whole lot of attention within that toward military families and especially new soldiers being targeted by these predatory payday lenders. Like, okay, that's not the sexiest issue in the world, but it's super important for the financial health and the respect afforded to people in the military. So little things like that when people aren't watching have been very good. I think the big failure is the VA. And the VA backlog on disability claims is a year, and it's getting worse. And it's disgusting. And it's a paperwork problem, it's a bureaucracy problem, and the VA has been failing for the entire time that President Obama has been in office. It was failing before him. They keep talking about fixing it. They're not fixing it. The VA Secretary, Eric Shinseki, who I have a lot of respect for other things he's done in his career, is now staying on for a second term after having manifestly failed to fix this problem in the first term. That stuff gets to me. It makes me feel emotionally bad. Like, how can we be a country that's got Oprah narrating the "You Have Been Cried For" 2-minute Super Bowl ad, and there are VA paper processing offices around the country where the buildings are collapsing under the weight of the stacked files? And people are waiting a year to hear whether or not they're going to get their disability. How can we have both of those things? That tells you that we've got an emotional connection to soldiers and their sacrifice that is not being met by a real connection. Because if it was a real connection, we would make sure that was fucking right. And it's not. So. I swore! I'm sorry.
All right, we'll go a little lighter. Dave Marcy asks, what's your least favorite buzzword?
Impact as a verb. Unless you are a proctologist. Dave. Sorry.
It's all right. Aggie asks, who is the most reasonable Republican you've ever interviewed, if any?
If any. Oh, you know, I wish that Republicans would let me interview them more. I actually have a lot of Republicans, like sources, I guess, people who will talk to me off the record about stuff that I'm covering, people who give me information, give me people to call, give me information that I might not have about what's going on, steer me if I'm getting something wrong or attributing something wrong. I talk to a lot of Republicans in the course of doing my work, and none of them will go on TV with me. And I think that's just because there's pressure in Republican circles to not be seen with me, or not be seen on MSNBC after breakfast time. So I mean, Joe's a Republican. It makes sense that Republicans would want to be seen with him, but for primetime, it's tough. And particularly for me, it's tough. So, I don't know. I talk to a lot of reasonable Republicans all the time, and the people who who I can persuade to come on the air, I feel like that we have reasonable discussions. Like Nicole Wallace and Steve Schmidt are people who I've had multiple discussions with. I feel like those discussions have been constructive. John Brabender, who was the Svengali for the Rick Santorum presidential campaign, least likely guy in the world to have a reasonable conversation with me, right? Totally reasonable conversations, and interesting and honest guy who's not afraid to do it. I wish more people would be willing to talk across the aisle. I used to have great conversations all the time on the air with both Rand Paul and Ron Paul. And then, when Rand Paul announced that he was running for Senate, he made the announcement on my show, which seems impossible now. We then subsequently had a very long, tense interview about the Civil Rights Act, and now he won't talk to me. He won't talk to me, and his dad won't talk to me. I was like, do you have other family members that are also blackballed now? Is this everybody? So I live in hope that people will come back, but so far it's not happening.
Sarah Peralta asks, any advice for budding journalists in this changing media landscape?
The media, I know nobody's going to believe me, but I really feel like the media is a meritocracy right now, more than it has been, more than it even was when I started, and I didn't start that long ago. Only because content is trafficable. And so whether you are writing for the Wall Street Journal or whether you are writing for BuzzFeed or whether you are writing for your own blog, if you are producing well-reported, original, trustworthy information, you're writing it well, you're sourcing it well, you're tracing the right stories, and you're advancing the story, you're going to get pickup. And by virtue of getting pickup, because people need the information that you are providing, you are going to be linked to, and people are going to remember your name, people are going to bookmark you and check you later. It has contributed to a real royal, I think, among journalistic talent, because everybody knows that there's always somebody else out there that they may not have heard of that may be getting the scoop. It's not just the other paper in your media market, it's anybody else who might choose to be reporting on this subject. And I do really feel like journalistic basics, journalistic ethics and skills, and in particular editing skills, are like a national need at this point. I feel like we need professional journalistic standards in a way that we've almost never needed them before, because stuff is so trafficable, it can get through under the net even if it's a lie. But if you're good, and if you're proven true, especially over multiple stories, you're going to get picked up. And so my best advice is to be awesome.
Darren says, you've done great coverage of marriage equality and DADT. What do you see as the next frontier for the LGBT community?
Darren, that is very nice of you to say. I think I get more credit for covering marriage equality than I deserve. I don't actually cover the marriage issue that much. I definitely cover Don't Ask, Don't Tell a lot. I think that the next frontier is going to be, at least the next frontier in reporting on it. I don't think this is necessarily the next activist cause. But the next thing that's going to happen is whatever is going to happen inside the Republican Party and inside the conservative movement. Right, so we've got this really interesting, very well-coordinated effort inside conservative politics to make conservatives pro-gay, or at least pro-gay rights. And it's kind of a very impressive brain trust on that side of it. And so far, it's not working. It's not working, at least in the sense that it's not paying off in electoral politics yet. So you've got 130 prominent Republicans signing this brief to the Supreme Court all about how they should do the right thing by gay rights in terms of the DOMA and Prop 8 cases that are coming up at the end of this month. But out of those 130 people, only 2 of them are elected officials. Well, maybe they weren't going for elected officials to get on there, but right now the brief that is, or the way that DOMA is being defended in the Supreme Court is because House Republicans are paying for it with your taxpayer dollars. So, yeah, Republicans are pro-gay rights now, except they're also really not. And that fight, sort of it's a fight between equals in Republican politics is a really interesting fight. To see Laura Bush and Colin Powell and Dick Cheney and Ken Mellman and John Huntsman and all these other interesting people really willing to not just be pro-gay rights, but lead on the issue and to tell people what they think and to essentially lobby their colleagues on it, some of them, has created a tension on the right that is, I think, unsustainable. And it's happening at a moment when the overtly anti-gay forces on the right suck. The National Organization for Marriage and the other groups that are overtly organizing and trying to raise money and running campaigns for anti-gay initiatives can't raise any money anymore. They're not nearly as successful as they were. They're losing all their good staff. They don't have any momentum. Nobody thinks they are the future. So what the pro-gay right side on within the Republican Party is fighting against is not some powerful anti-gay side. The anti-gay side is falling apart. What they're fighting against is just inertia. And it's going to be fascinating to watch. So far, it's going way slower than I thought it would. Everybody thinks it's moving very fast. I think that it can't possibly go this much slower, this slow for this much longer.
Yeah, the Republican Party, not just with gay rights, but with a whole bunch of issues, seems to be trying to make some sort of shift in the interest of the next election. How close are they, or are we, to having that shift?
They are having what I like to think of as an odd-numbered year shift. So when nobody's running for anything, they're all being very brave. And then we'll see next year when there's actually people who got to put their name on the ballot. I will be very interested to see if on immigration and on gay rights and on some of these other issues, maybe even abortion, on which there is a sort of pundit consensus that there needs to be evolution in the Republican Party. It'll be interesting to see whether, when it comes to Republican primaries, people are actually losing Republican primaries because they're too pro-gay. Is that still going to happen next year in the Republican primaries? Are people going to lose Republican primaries in more than a handful of places because they're seeing as advancing the homosexual agenda, or not protecting the unborn enough, or not sealing the borders, being for amnesty? The conversation in the Beltway and the conversation in sort of the political media is like, oh, that stuff is done. But you look at the way that Republicans are behaving in the states where they're actually in control, and they're still full steam ahead on all of that stuff. So I think next year is going to be really fascinating to watch to see whether or not any of these confident pundit predictions actually come true.
All right, Emily wants to know what your favorite beer is.
Oh, that's like asking what's your favorite song. Which is your favorite child? I'm childless, so that's never mind.
Similar.
My beer taste evolves. You know, have you ever tried that? Are you a beer drinker?
From time to time.
Okay. You ever tried that Dale's Pale Ale from Oscar Blues? That's really good, right? I'm having a Dale's phase. I really like I'm a Guinness drinker from way back, and I really like the. This is probably not nice to say. I should probably mention something Texas, but I don't know enough about Texas beer to pander. There's a beer that comes out at Christmas time, which is called Celebration Ale from Sierra Nevada, which is really good too. And I've actually written to the company and asked them if they will please sell it other times of year. So if anybody is here from Sierra Nevada, please talk to me.
All right, Cassandra Stalzer asks, do we have enough political will to see any gun control measures enacted?
That is the $64,000 question. I was surprised so what happened in Congress at the federal level is that on the Senate side, they picked 4 bills, right? So they picked the assault weapons thing, they picked schools can have more money and resources for upping school security, they picked making gun trafficking a federal crime, and they picked background checks. So those 4. And they decided not to move them as a package, but to move them 1, 2, 3, 4, like a la carte, so they could, so some senators who weren't for the assault weapons ban but might be for the background checks bill wouldn't feel constrained. First one that they advanced was making gun trafficking a federal crime. Now think about the sort of optics of that. Well, you don't want to be seen as taking anybody's guns away, but you do want to be seen as tough on crime. Well, here's theoretically a gun control measure that will take away nobody's guns. That is a tough on crime, federalizing making the penalties stronger kind of thing. Like you'd think this one would just be a gimme. It got 1 Republican vote. Chuck Grassley. I was very surprised. I admit to being naive. I was surprised. I thought that would get more. On the background checks, I had thought that would be most Republicans, but with trafficking only getting 1 vote, I don't know. I mean, what would be amazing is if the Republicans decided, you know what, on these issues we're not going to filibuster them, we're going to let it be a majority vote. And then we're not going to whip on it, people can decide what their conscience. That would be an act of good faith. I don't think they're going to do that. You are seeing stuff move in some states. Colorado had a sort of epic day. They moved 7 bills on Friday, and a lot of those will come up to fruition on Monday, and then the governor's going to have to decide whether to sign them. But in all blue states and blue-controlled states, I think we're going to see stuff move. In Connecticut, obviously in New York, Colorado, it's just going to be real interesting at the federal level. It's a real open question.
Yeah, it's obvious why there's been an outcry for bans on assault weapons and things like that. But why do you think, when we know that a majority of injuries and deaths in this country are the result of handguns, we can't even get handguns into the conversation?
Handguns, I think the reason that people don't see it as a practical political move is because of the argument that handguns are for self-defense, even though they are absolutely the cause of most unlawful killings and unlawful and injuries, gun-related injuries. But also, there's just so freaking many of them. And that's part of the argument on the anti-gun reform side, too, is that, listen, there's 300 million guns in the country right now. We are about to hit the tipping point where there's actually more guns in the country than people. It's like 317 million or something. We're right up there. That doesn't mean that more Americans own guns. Actually, the number of Americans who own guns has been decreasing. It's just, of the people who own guns, they own more and more and more of them, which gives you some insight into the politics. But on handguns, yeah, I mean, the practical impact in the world in terms of who gets shot, where and why, is pretty divorced from the practical impact of what might move. And I don't necessarily think that's the end of the discussion. But, I mean, honestly, some of this stuff, we talk about extended magazines, right? There's a strong gun reform case to make about, well, people, if you're protecting yourself, or if you're out hunting, or if you're target shooting, or you're doing any of the things that is a lawful use for your gun, you shouldn't need dozens and dozens of bullets at once. The only person who's going to need dozens and dozens of bullets is somebody who's trying to engage in a mass shooting of a lot of different people. And that makes a lot of sense. That said, the standard size clip in a Glock semi-automatic pistol is 15 rounds. The standard size clip. That's not the extended clip. That's not the one that hangs down below the hand grip. That's the one that fits right into it. And so, all right, everybody says 10 rounds is the limit for an extended magazine. Well, is that going to render everybody who owns a Glock handgun, is that an unusable or illegal weapon now? Well, practically speaking, no. There's millions of those guns in the country, and so maybe we should be talking about 15 instead of 10. Does that mean that more people are going to die? Maybe. What's practical? What can we move forward on? What can we get consensus on? I mean, this does have to be decided in a democratic context, and so it is frustrating to see the distance between what's practical and what makes a good argument, and what's practical and what can move, but ultimately that's the way we do it.
Adam asks, have you ever considered running for president?
President of what? I'm not even president of my own house. No. No. I have never wanted to run for anything, but thank you.
Okay. Maybe Sierra Nevada?
Yeah, president. I will. It'll be a hostile coup of Sierra Nevada if they turn down my request on Celebration Ale. I want it in June. Sorry.
Okay. Ian says, fill in the blank. South by Southwest is a lot like.
Oh, it's just like SAT flashback trauma. South by Southwest is a lot like. I feel like it's a cross between a political convention and Lollapalooza. I mean, I'm wrong, I'm sure. I'm sure you could all come up with better analogies. But for me, the combination of the rock and roll ethos and actual rock and roll with an earnest willingness to discuss and to do so in a generalist way, like come one, come all, let's talk this out, is kind of the best of both. You know, it's the best of all worlds. And I don't know, I sort of wish this was year-round too. Maybe I should write to the president here.
All right, Sita asks, when or why did people start voting for their party only regardless whether the person is a good candidate or an incompetent one?
Oh, why do people vote party instead of person?
Yeah.
People have always, I mean, as long as we've had political parties, people have done stupid things with regard to political parties. I mean, there's a reason that we used to have fights at the founding of the country about whether or not we should be a country that even had political parties. Partisanship, for partisanship's sake, leads us to doing a lot of stupid stuff. That said, in defense of partisanship, I also think that we come up with better policy outcomes when we have better arguments. And so, like, for example, on the issue of foreign policy, which I think, and the use of force, which I think a lot about because of the book, I think that essentially since the Bush-Cheney years and sort of the collapse of neoconservatism, the Republican Party has had nothing to say about foreign policy and the use of the military. Nothing to say that is useful. And we've started to get the articulation of the more libertarian streak in conservative and Republican politics, which is good, and I have high hopes that that will become a more interesting discussion. But like right now, I'm psyched that Rand Paul had his 13-hour filibuster, and I'm also bummed that for most of it, he really didn't make any sense. And I mean, I think that it's really important that the Republican Party develop the ability to have a cogent, real, serious, steeped in the actual world take on what we ought to do with the military and what we ought to do in terms of war and peace, so that Democrats have somebody to force them to make a good argument. Because if only Democrats are the ones that are having a substantive discussion about any policy, but especially something about America's role in the world, and everybody else is like, you know, I mean, remember that Hillary Clinton showed up to the Benghazi hearing and Rand Paul was like, there was a ghost ship that left Libya. I want you to tell me about the ghost ship that went to Syria from Libya, the ghost ship. And Hillary Clinton was like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, if you're the answer, you're not making any sense. And there needs to be a good fight, because if you don't have a good fight, you don't have a good outcome. The best argument has to win, and if the best argument isn't tested because the other side is stupid, then you end up enacting bad policies that didn't have to survive any sort of real crucible in order to be decided on. And so we need, if parties can insulate their members enough to grow them into people who are good at not only knowing what's going on in the world, but good at articulating it and fighting about it, so that we can have really substantive, you know, clash of equals fights on these issues, we will be better for it. And so I do not believe that that partisanship is always wrong. I believe it leads us to do dumb things in the short run. But I have high hopes that that the party structure can actually serve to make us have better fights as a country. And the more we fight about stuff, the better we fight about stuff, the better our policy outcomes will be from those fights.
Well, thank you for coming, Rachel.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much for being here.